When a gifted black student, Elijah, excels in a math midterm, his teacher accuses him of cheating instead of praising his achievement. As tensions rise, Elijah faces not only the test of proving his innocence, but also confronting the deep-rooted biases that have kept him in the shadows. Will he be able to rise above the prejudice and claim the recognition he deserves, or will his talent continue to be doubted? Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know where you're watching from. Let's dive in. Elijah sat at the back of the classroom, his hand raised cautiously in the air. His eyes darted between his classmates and the teacher, Mr. Wilson, as he waited, hoping today would be different. His fingers began to tingle from holding his arm up so long, but he refused to lower it. He had a question about the complex equation on the board, one that had been rattling in his mind for the past few minutes. But Mr. Wilson, as usual, seemed to be looking through him rather than at him. "Can anyone else tell me the first step in solving this equation?" Mr. Wilson asked, his eyes sweeping across the room. Elijah's heart sank as he watched the teacher's gaze skim right past him, settling instead on Lisa, a girl in the front row who often struggled with math. Lisa nervously looked down at her notebook, unsure of how to respond. Elijah's hand dropped to his desk, the weight of disappointment familiar but still heavy. He could feel Marcus, his best friend, sitting beside him, nudging him slightly. Marcus whispered, "Bro, you know the answer. Why doesn't he ever call on you?" Elijah shrugged, forcing a tight smile, but inside he felt the gnawing frustration he had carried for so long. No matter how prepared he was, no matter how many times he raised his hand, Mr. Wilson either ignored him or dismissed his questions altogether. This wasn't the first time Elijah had been passed over in class. Ever since the start of the semester, he had noticed a pattern. Mr. Wilson would call on the same group of students, mainly the ones who struggled or who fit a particular mold. Elijah, despite being one of the top students, was never part of that group. He knew why, though he wished he didn't. His mother had warned him about this. "Elijah," his mother often said, "sometimes people won't see you for who you are. They'll see you for what they think you are. But that's their limitation, not yours." She always said this with a mixture of pride and sadness, knowing that her son would face challenges simply because of the color of his skin. Elijah tried to internalize her words, to not let the slights get to him, but some days were harder than others. Mr. Wilson's voice broke through his thoughts. "All right, everyone, I want you to try this next problem on your own. I'll be walking around to help if you need it." He turned back to the board, writing out a new equation that was even more complex than the last. Elijah stared at the board, the numbers and variables swirling together. He knew how to approach it, but the lack of acknowledgement from his teacher had drained his enthusiasm. Beside him, Marcus tapped his pencil, clearly waiting for Elijah to take the lead. They often worked together on class problems, and Marcus had always respected Elijah's mathematical skills. But today, Elijah felt defeated. Mr. Wilson began making his rounds, stopping at different students' desks to offer help or guidance. He spent extra time with Lisa, coaching her through each step of the equation. Elijah's eyes followed him as he moved around the room, but when Mr. Wilson approached Elijah's side of the room, he simply walked past, not even glancing in his direction. A soft sigh escaped Elijah's lips. Marcus leaned over and whispered, "Yo, I swear he's got it out for you. You should say something." "What's the point?" Elijah muttered, barely audible. "He's not going to listen. It's like I'm invisible." The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Students gathered their books and hurried out, eager for lunch. Elijah stayed behind, packing his things slowly. Mr. Wilson stood at his desk, shuffling through papers, completely oblivious to Elijah's presence. As Elijah slung his backpack over his shoulder and headed for the door, he heard Mr. Wilson call out, "Make sure you're all ready for the midterm next week. It's going to be challenging, and I expect everyone to be prepared." Elijah glanced back, meeting Mr. Wilson's eyes for the briefest moment before the teacher turned away. There it was again, that subtle dismissal, the feeling of being unseen. He stepped into the hallway, where Marcus was waiting for him. "You all right, man?" Marcus asked, concern etched on his face. Elijah forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm good. Just tired, I guess." But inside, Elijah wasn't just tired. He was exhausted. Tired of being overlooked, tired of working twice as hard only to be ignored. As they walked to the cafeteria, Marcus kept talking, but Elijah's mind was elsewhere. The midterm next week was going to be his chance to prove himself, not just to Mr. Wilson, but to the entire class. He knew he could solve the equations. Math had always come easily to him. But he also knew that proving his intelligence wouldn't be enough. He had to break through the wall of indifference that Mr. Wilson had built around him. That night, as Elijah sat at the kitchen table, textbooks spread out before him, his mother walked in, holding a cup of tea. She sat down across from him, watching him for a moment before speaking. "You're thinking about that midterm, aren't you?" she asked gently. Elijah nodded, not looking up from his notes. "Whatever's bothering you, remember what I always tell you," she said softly. "You have to believe in yourself, even when others don't. The world isn't always fair, but that doesn't mean you give up." Elijah met her eyes, her words sinking in like a balm to his frustration. "I just wish? I don't know. I wish he could see me for who I really am, not just some stereotype." "He will," she said firmly, "but you have to keep showing him, whether he's ready to see it or not." Elijah nodded, feeling a sense of determination rising in him again. He was ready. No more waiting for someone else's approval. This midterm was going to be the turning point, and he was going to make sure that, this time, Mr. Wilson had no choice but to see him. The following days passed in a blur as the midterm approached. Elijah found himself sinking deeper into his studies, driven by a growing desire not just to pass the test, but to excel in a way that couldn't be ignored. Each night, after finishing his homework, he would stay up late, poring over additional math problems, scouring the internet for challenging equations, and pushing his mind to new limits. If Mr. Wilson wasn't going to see him, Elijah was determined to make himself undeniable. At school, the atmosphere in the classroom had shifted slightly. While most of the students were absorbed in preparing for the exam, a few had started noticing how Elijah was consistently overlooked. Sarah, one of the top students in the class, approached him after a lesson, her face thoughtful. "Hey Elijah, do you want to go over some of the problems from class together?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "I've noticed you've been really focused lately." Elijah glanced at her, surprised by the offer. Sarah was known for her independence and rarely worked with others. He nodded slowly. "Yeah, sure. I'm always up for more practice." They agreed to meet in the library after school, and as Elijah walked away, he couldn't help but feel a small spark of hope. Maybe some of his classmates were beginning to see what Mr. Wilson refused to acknowledge. But as the days went on, his interactions with Mr. Wilson remained the same, distant and dismissive. Elijah's resolve, however, only grew stronger. He was fueled by a quiet resistance, a determination to rise above the prejudice that seemed to cloud Mr. Wilson's view of him. He began studying not just for the midterm, but for something deeper, a desire to reclaim his sense of worth, to prove to himself that he could succeed even when the odds were stacked against him. One afternoon, as Elijah was packing up his books after class, Marcus approached him with a frown. "Man, I don't get it. You know this stuff better than anyone, and he still doesn't give you the time of day." Elijah sighed, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "Yeah, I've noticed, but I'm not going to let it get to me. I'll just let my work speak for itself." Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice. "I don't know how you do it, bro. If that were me, I'd probably lose it, but you just keep your head down and push through." Elijah smiled faintly. "I have to, man. What else can I do?" The truth was, it wasn't easy. Every day that Mr. Wilson ignored him, every time his hand remained raised only to be passed over, Elijah felt a mixture of frustration and sadness. But he also knew that letting his emotions take control wouldn't help him. He had seen too many people fall into that trap, letting anger and resentment eat away at them until it became all they could see. Elijah refused to be consumed by bitterness. That evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table again, his textbooks open in front of him. His mother, Mrs. Thompson, bustled around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared dinner. She glanced over at Elijah and noticed the tightness in his expression. "How's the studying going?" she asked, sitting down across from him with a tired but warm smile. Elijah sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's going. I just feel like no matter how hard I try, it's never enough." His mother reached out, placing a gentle hand on his. Elijah, don't let other people's blindness make you doubt yourself. You've always been smart, always worked hard. This test won't define you, but I know you'll do great. You just have to stay focused on what you can control. Elijah nodded, her words soothing some of the tension he'd been carrying. His mother had always been his greatest supporter, reminding him to keep his head high even when the world seemed determined to knock him down. She had faced her own battles with discrimination throughout her life, and she had raised Elijah to be strong in the face of adversity. Later that night, as Elijah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind wandered back to Mr. Wilson. He wondered why the teacher had such a hard time seeing him. Was it truly unconscious? Or was there something more deliberate behind the way he was being treated? Elijah had always excelled in math, ever since he was a kid. Numbers and equations came naturally to him, like a second language. He couldn't understand why someone like Mr. Wilson, who should have appreciated his talent, seemed to go out of his way to ignore it. The next morning, as Elijah walked into class, he felt a strange sense of anticipation. The midterm was just days away, and the classroom buzzed with a nervous energy. Mr. Wilson stood at the front, going over a final review, his voice calm but stern as he outlined the most challenging concepts that would appear on the test. As Elijah followed along, something inside him shifted. He realized that it didn't matter anymore if Mr. Wilson called on him or not. The quiet resistance he had been cultivating within himself had grown into something stronger, an unshakable belief in his own abilities. Whether Mr. Wilson saw him or not, Elijah knew his worth. He would let his actions speak louder than words. At the end of the class, Mr. Wilson handed out a practice test, instructing the students to work on it independently. Elijah sat down, focusing intently on the problems in front of him. Each equation felt like a challenge he was ready to meet head-on, and by the time the bell rang, he had finished the entire practice test without breaking a sweat. As the students packed up to leave, Mr. Wilson called out, "Remember, the midterm is in 2 days. Make sure you're prepared. I don't want anyone to come to me with excuses if they don't do well." Elijah caught Mr. Wilson's eye for a brief moment, but the teacher quickly looked away, dismissing him as he always did. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he remained calm. He didn't need Mr. Wilson's approval. He had something far more important: belief in himself. That afternoon, Elijah met up with Sarah in the library, as they had planned. They spent the next hour going over the practice test, comparing answers, and discussing different approaches to the more difficult problems. As they worked together, Sarah paused, her brow furrowing. "You know, Elijah, you really know your stuff," she said, tapping her pencil thoughtfully against the table. "I don't get why Mr. Wilson doesn't give you more credit." Elijah shrugged, the now familiar weight of the situation resting on his shoulders. "I don't know, maybe he just doesn't see me the way he sees the others." Sarah frowned. "Well, I think you're going to surprise him. You're one of the best in this class, and I can't wait to see the look on his face when you ace that midterm." Elijah smiled, appreciating her support. "Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to give it everything I've got." As the sun began to set outside the library windows, casting a golden glow across the bookshelves, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent too long being quiet, too long letting someone else's perception of him dictate how he felt about himself. But now, with the midterm looming, he was ready to step into the light. Not for Mr. Wilson, not for anyone else, but for himself. The midterm was coming, and Elijah knew that this was his moment. No matter what happened, he would face it with confidence, knowing that he had done everything in his power to succeed. And when the day of the test finally arrived, he would be ready to show the world and himself what he was truly capable of. The day of the midterm arrived with a crisp chill in the air, signaling a shift not just in the season, but in Elijah's mindset. He walked into school that morning with a quiet determination, his backpack slung over his shoulder and his thoughts focused solely on the test ahead. He had prepared for this moment, not just academically, but emotionally. Today was the day he would show everyone, especially Mr. Wilson, what he was truly capable of. The hallways were buzzing with nervous energy as students gathered in small groups, exchanging notes and last-minute questions. Elijah passed through them, a few nods from classmates acknowledging his presence, but he kept to himself. Marcus, who had arrived earlier, caught up with him by the lockers. "You ready for this, bro?" Marcus asked, slapping a hand on Elijah's shoulder. Elijah nodded, feeling the weight of his friend's gaze. "Yeah, I'm ready. I've been ready." Marcus grinned. "That's what I'm talking about. Knock 'em dead, E." Elijah smiled at the encouragement, but inside his nerves were simmering. He wasn't worried about the test itself. He had studied enough to know he was more than prepared for whatever Mr. Wilson had in store. What made his stomach twist was the lingering doubt about how he would be perceived. He wanted to be recognized for his efforts, not questioned or dismissed because of who he was. As he walked into the classroom, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Students shuffled to their seats, glancing up at the clock, each tick amplifying the quiet anxiety in the room. Mr. Wilson stood at the front, his usual demeanor, cool and detached. He handed out the test papers without fanfare, his expression neutral, as though this exam was just another routine task to get through. Elijah wondered if he had any idea how much this test meant to him. "All right, class, you have exactly 2 hours to complete the midterm," Mr. Wilson announced as he handed out the last of the papers. "Take your time, show your work, and remember, no excuses for unfinished problems." Elijah took a deep breath as the test landed on his desk. The pages felt thick and heavy between his fingers as he flipped through the problems. As expected, the equations were complex, the kind of problems that required focus, patience, and a deep understanding of mathematical theory. But Elijah felt a strange sense of calm wash over him as he scanned the questions. He had seen similar problems in his studies, even harder ones in the extra work he had taken on outside of class. He could do this. The classroom fell into an intense silence as everyone began working. The only sounds were the scratching of pencils on paper and the occasional shuffling of papers. Elijah bent over his desk, his pencil gliding smoothly as he moved from one problem to the next. His confidence grew with each equation, the numbers falling into place as if the solutions had been waiting for him all along. Midway through the test, Elijah looked up briefly, his gaze settling on Mr. Wilson. The teacher was walking between the rows of desks, occasionally pausing to check on a student's progress. Elijah's eyes followed him, wondering if this time Mr. Wilson might stop and acknowledge his work. But just as in the past, Mr. Wilson walked right past his desk, his gaze not even lingering for a second. Elijah felt a familiar pang of frustration, but quickly shoved it aside. This wasn't about Mr. Wilson anymore. This was about proving to himself that he belonged here, that his talent was undeniable, even if it went unnoticed by some. He returned to his test with renewed focus, his pencil moving with purpose. As the minutes ticked by, some students began to fidget in their seats, the difficulty of the test becoming apparent. Elijah, however, remained steady, his hand never faltering as he worked through the final equations. He knew he had nailed it. By the time he reached the last problem, a particularly complex algebraic equation that had stumped many students in practice, he was ready. He mapped out the steps in his head, taking a moment to breathe before writing the first number. The answer unfolded smoothly, like the solution had been there waiting for him all along. Elijah finished the problem with 10 minutes to spare, a sense of satisfaction settling over him. He glanced around the room, noticing the furrowed brows and tense expressions of his classmates as they rushed to complete their tests. Marcus caught his eye from across the room, raising his eyebrows in question. Elijah gave him a small nod, signaling that he had finished. Marcus grinned, returning to his own test with renewed determination. Elijah leaned back in his chair, feeling a strange sense of calm. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't doubting himself. The final bell rang, and Mr. Wilson instructed the class to hand in their tests. Elijah gathered his things, moving to the front of the room where students lined up to submit their papers. He handed his in with a quiet confidence, briefly meeting Mr. Wilson's gaze. There was no acknowledgement in the teacher's expression, just a quick nod before he moved on to the next student. Elijah walked out of the room, refusing to let the lack of recognition dampen his mood. He had done his best, and that was enough. The next few days were a blur of anticipation. The midterm had passed, but the weight of the unknown results lingered over the students like a heavy cloud. Elijah continued his routine, attending classes, spending time with Marcus, and preparing for the next lessons, but his mind kept drifting back to the test. When the day came for Mr. Wilson to return the graded exams, the classroom was filled with nervous chatter. Elijah sat at his desk, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood, waiting for his name to be called. Mr. Wilson walked up and down the rows, handing out the tests one by one. When he finally reached Elijah, the pause was noticeable. Mr. Wilson looked down at the paper in his hand, then back at Elijah. His expression was unreadable. "Elijah," he said, his voice measured, "you did exceptionally well." Elijah blinked, the words not quite registering at first. He reached out and took the paper, his eyes immediately scanning the top for the score. A bold 100% was written in red ink at the top of the page, circled with a note that simply read, "Outstanding work." Elijah felt a rush of pride, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He had done it. He had aced the midterm, just as he knew he could. He glanced at Marcus, who gave him an enthusiastic thumbs up from across the room, his grin wide and infectious. But just as Elijah was about to bask in the moment, Mr. Wilson's next words brought the mood crashing down. "However," Mr. Wilson continued, his tone suddenly colder, "I find it difficult to believe that you achieved this result entirely on your own." Elijah's heart sank. He stared at Mr. Wilson, unsure if he had heard him correctly. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Mr. Wilson crossed his arms, his gaze hard. "I've never seen you perform at this level before. To go from average to perfect, it raises questions. I'm not accusing you outright, but I'd like to have a conversation about your test." Elijah felt the blood drain from his face. The room had gone quiet, and he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. The pride he had felt just moments ago was replaced with anger and disbelief. After all his hard work, after staying up late, pushing himself to the limit, this was what he got? Accusations of cheating? Marcus stood up from his desk, his voice cutting through the tension. "That's not right, man. Elijah's been grinding for weeks. He didn't cheat." Mr. Wilson's expression remained stern. "I'm simply doing my job, Marcus. I have to make sure everything is above board." Elijah clenched his fists, his mind racing. This wasn't just about the test anymore. It was about something much deeper, something he had felt all along, but had never wanted to admit. Mr. Wilson had never seen him for what he was capable of. And now, when he had finally proved himself, it still wasn't enough. Elijah stood up slowly, his eyes locking with Mr. Wilson's. "I didn't cheat," he said, his voice firm. "I studied hard, and I earned that grade. You can question it all you want, but I know the truth, and so do you." For a moment, Mr. Wilson looked taken aback, as though he hadn't expected Elijah to stand up for himself. The tension in the room was palpable, but Elijah refused to back down. He had spent too long being silent, too long letting someone else's bias determine his worth. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Wilson nodded slowly. "Very well," he said, his voice softer now. "We'll see." Elijah sat back down, his heart still pounding in his chest, but he felt lighter. He had spoken his truth, and no matter what Mr. Wilson or anyone else thought, he knew he had done the work. That was what mattered. As the class ended and the students filed out, Marcus walked over and clapped him on the back. "You handled that like a boss, man. Don't let him get to you." Elijah smiled, the tension slowly ebbing away. "Thanks, Marcus. I'm not going to." And for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The air felt heavy with tension as Elijah walked home after school, his mind replaying the events of the day like a broken record. He had never expected things to escalate like they had in the classroom. And yet, here he was, fighting a battle he didn't ask for. Mr. Wilson's thinly veiled accusations weighed heavily on him. He had worked harder than ever to prepare for that midterm. And even with a perfect score in hand, it still wasn't enough to break through the wall of doubt and prejudice that his teacher had constructed around him. Elijah's steps slowed as he neared his house. His mother's car was parked in the driveway, and the warm glow of the living room lights spilled out through the windows. Normally, this sight would bring him comfort, but today it only made the knot in his stomach tighten. How was he supposed to explain to his mother that, despite his best efforts, his success had been met with suspicion and mistrust? He pushed open the front door, the familiar creak of the hinges announcing his arrival. His mother, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, looked up with a smile. "Hey, sweetheart. How was your day?" she asked, her voice warm and inviting. Elijah hesitated for a moment before answering, his gaze fixed on the floor. "It was rough." Mrs. Thompson's smile faded as she stood up, concern washing over her face. "What happened?" Elijah walked over to the kitchen table and sat down heavily in the chair across from her. He placed his backpack on the floor and rubbed his temples, feeling the tension in his body refuse to ease. "I got my midterm back today." He started slowly, his voice low. "I aced it, got a perfect score." His mother's eyes lit up with pride. "Elijah, that's amazing. I knew you'd do well." But Elijah didn't return the smile. Instead, he let out a slow, frustrated breath. "That's the thing, Mom. I did exactly what I set out to do, but Mr. Wilson doesn't believe I did it on my own. He practically accused me of cheating, right in front of the class." The room fell into a thick silence. Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted, the pride in her eyes dimming as a frown settled on her lips. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers curling around the handle of her teacup. "He said that to you? In front of everyone?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with disbelief. Elijah nodded. "Yeah, he didn't outright say I cheated, but he made it pretty clear that he doesn't believe I could have done that well. It's like he's always looking for a reason to doubt me." Mrs. Thompson was quiet for a moment, her face unreadable, as she processed what Elijah had told her. Finally, she spoke, her voice measured. "Elijah, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. I know how hard you've worked, and it's not fair that someone would question your success just because they can't see past their own biases." Elijah looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his notebook absent-mindedly. I thought if I did everything right, if I proved myself, it would be enough. But it's like no matter what I do, it's never enough." His mother reached out, placing her hand gently on top of his. "It is enough, Elijah. You are enough. What Mr. Wilson did is wrong, and it's not a reflection of you or your abilities. It's a reflection of his own limitations, and that's something he'll have to face." Elijah sighed, feeling a mix of frustration and sadness. He had spent so much time trying to prove himself, only to be met with more resistance. It felt like a losing battle. "I don't know what to do," Elijah admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to make him see me for who I really am." Mrs. Thompson gave his hand a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to make him see you, Elijah. You just have to keep being yourself. You've already shown that you're more than capable. Whether Mr. Wilson acknowledges it or not, the truth will speak for itself." Elijah wanted to believe her, but the doubt in his heart was hard to shake. He had always been taught to rise above, to keep his head high no matter what. But right now, it felt like he was drowning under the weight of expectations he couldn't meet. The next day at school, Elijah's mind was still clouded with thoughts of the confrontation with Mr. Wilson. As he walked through the hallways, he could feel the eyes of his classmates on him. Some looked curious, others indifferent, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all silently judging him. Was everyone wondering if he had cheated? Did they believe Mr. Wilson's insinuations? Marcus caught up with him by his locker, his usual upbeat energy slightly muted. "Hey man, how you holding up?" Elijah shrugged, avoiding his friend's eyes as he fumbled with the combination on his locker. "I'm all right, I guess." Marcus leaned against the locker next to him, his brow furrowed. "I know that whole thing with Wilson was messed up, but don't let it get in your head. You know you earned that grade. Anyone with half a brain can see that." "Yeah, but it's not just about the grade," Elijah said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "It's about him thinking I'm not good enough, no matter how hard I try. I'm tired of always being doubted." Marcus was quiet for a moment before he spoke, his voice soft but firm. "You've always been good enough, Elijah. You've just got to keep proving it. Not to him, but to yourself." Elijah wanted to believe that, but it felt like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. He closed his locker with a sigh and followed Marcus to their next class, his mind still heavy with doubt. The days dragged on, and despite the confrontation with Mr. Wilson, nothing seemed to change. The teacher continued to treat Elijah with the same distant indifference, and while the accusations of cheating had quieted down, The tension between them lingered in the air, unspoken, but ever present. One afternoon, as Elijah was leaving school, he saw Sarah standing by the entrance, her expression serious. She approached him, her brow furrowed. "Elijah, I wanted to talk to you about what happened in class the other day," she said, her voice low. "I saw the way Mr. Wilson treated you, and it wasn't right. A few of us have been talking, and we think you should go to the administration." Elijah frowned, surprised by her suggestion. "Go to the administration? What good would that do?" Sarah crossed her arms, her voice filled with conviction. "You were accused of something you didn't do? And it's not just about the test. Mr. Wilson's been treating you differently for a long time, and it's not okay. If we don't speak up, nothing's going to change." Elijah hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. He had always tried to handle things on his own, believing that if he just worked hard enough, he could rise above the unfair treatment. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe it was time to stop being silent. Later that evening, after talking it over with his mother, Elijah decided to take action. With her support, he drafted a letter to the school administration, detailing the incidents with Mr. Wilson and the pattern of discrimination he had experienced throughout the semester. It wasn't an easy decision, but as he wrote, he felt a sense of release, as if the act of putting his experiences into words was a step toward reclaiming his power. A few days later, Elijah was called into a meeting with the principal, Ms. Adams, Mr. Wilson, and his mother. The atmosphere in the room was tense, but Elijah felt ready. His mother sat beside him, her calm presence a source of strength. Ms. Adams began the meeting with a soft but firm tone. "Elijah, I've read through your letter and spoken to a few of your classmates. It seems there's been a misunderstanding, and we're here to clear the air." Elijah felt his pulse quicken as he glanced at Mr. Wilson, who sat stiffly in his chair, his expression guarded. This was the moment he had been dreading, but also the moment he had been waiting for. He took a deep breath and spoke clearly. "I didn't cheat on that test," Elijah began, his voice steady. "I worked hard for that score, and I've been working hard all semester. But it's not just about the test. It's about how I've been treated in this class, like I'm invisible. Like I'm not worth the same attention or respect as other students. I've raised my hand, asked questions, and been ignored. And when I finally do something right, instead of being recognized, I'm accused of cheating." Mr. Wilson's face remained unreadable, but Miss Adams nodded slowly, her gaze shifting between the two of them. "Elijah, I hear you, and your concerns are valid. Mr. Wilson, would you like to respond?" Mr. Wilson cleared his throat, his voice measured. "I never intended to make Elijah feel singled out or disrespected. I have high expectations for all my students, and sometimes that means questioning results when they seem out of the ordinary. But I see now that I may have handled this situation poorly, and for that, I apologize." Elijah's heart pounded in his chest. The apology felt hollow, but at least it was an acknowledgement. He didn't need Mr. Wilson to fully understand what he had been through. He just needed him to recognize that his actions had consequences. Ms. Adams looked at both of them with a firm gaze. "I think it's clear that there's been a misunderstanding. But moving forward, I expect that we will all treat each other with respect. Elijah, your hard work has not gone unnoticed, and we will continue to support you in your academic journey." As the meeting came to an end, Elijah felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a step in the right direction. He had stood up for himself, and in doing so, he had reclaimed a part of his identity that had been overshadowed by doubt and prejudice. Walking out of the office with his mother by his side, Elijah felt a sense of quiet triumph. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Elijah walked down the hallway of the school, his mind racing as he processed the events of the meeting. The conversation with Miss Adams and Mr. Wilson had left him feeling a mixture of emotions: relief, frustration, and oddly, hope. The apology from Mr. Wilson had been less than he had wanted, but it was a step in the right direction. More importantly, Elijah had taken a stand, something he never thought he would do. As he pushed open the doors and stepped outside, the cool breeze hit his face, bringing him back to the present. His mother walked beside him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, giving him a comforting squeeze. "I'm proud of you, Elijah," she said softly. "You handled yourself with grace and strength. Not everyone would have done what you did." Elijah nodded, though his thoughts were still swirling. "It just doesn't feel like it's over, Mom. I mean," he apologized, "but I don't know. I guess I thought it would feel more satisfying, like a win." His mother gave him a thoughtful look. "Sometimes standing up for yourself isn't about winning or losing. It's about making sure your voice is heard. And today, you were heard. That's a victory in itself." Elijah exhaled, realizing the truth in her words. The weight of always having to prove himself, because of his skin color, because of assumptions people made, had been heavy for so long. Today, though, that burden had started to lift, even if just a little. He had shown Mr. Wilson, his classmates, and, most importantly himself, that he wasn't going to stay silent anymore. As the days passed, Elijah noticed subtle changes. Mr. Wilson no longer ignored him during class. While the teacher didn't go out of his way to call on Elijah, there was no longer the blatant dismissal of his questions. It was a shift, however small, and it gave Elijah a sense of cautious optimism. He realized that changing deeply ingrained biases wasn't something that would happen overnight. But this felt like the beginning of something different. Something better. At school, the conversation about what had happened in the meeting spread among the students. Sarah, Marcus, and a few others made sure to let people know that Elijah had stood his ground and had done so with dignity. There was no more whispering about whether he had cheated, and the cloud of doubt that had hung over him seemed to dissipate. Even though not everyone was vocal about it, Elijah could feel the difference in how people treated him. One afternoon, while Elijah was in the library working on a new math assignment, Sarah approached him with a bright smile. She placed her notebook down next to him and slid into the seat across the table. "Hey, Elijah, I heard some news that might interest you," she said, her voice filled with excitement. Elijah looked up from his work, intrigued. "What's up?" "You remember that regional math competition I mentioned a while back? The one where they take students who excel in math from different schools to compete in teams? Well, I just found out that our school is sending a team, and Mr. Wilson recommended you to be one of the representatives." Elijah stared at her in disbelief, his mind struggling to process what she had just said. "Wait, what? Mr. Wilson recommended me?" Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "Yep, he submitted your name along with a couple of other students, but from what I heard, you're one of the top picks. The competition is in a few weeks, so you'll have time to prepare." Elijah felt a rush of emotions, surprise, pride, and maybe even a little disbelief. Mr. Wilson had been the last person he expected to advocate for him in any capacity, let alone something like this. After everything that had happened, this recommendation felt like an acknowledgement of his abilities, a recognition of the hard work he had put in, despite the obstacles. "Wow," Elijah murmured, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't see that coming." Sarah grinned. "Well, you deserve it. You've been killing it in math, and this competition is a huge deal. It's a chance to really show everyone what you're made of." Elijah nodded, the excitement beginning to settle in. This was an opportunity, a real opportunity to prove, not just to Mr. Wilson or his classmates, but to himself that he belonged in these spaces. For so long, he had been fighting to be seen, to be acknowledged, and now it felt like the tide was finally turning. In the weeks leading up to the competition, Elijah threw himself into preparation. He met with the other students who had been selected to form the school's team, and together they worked on practice problems, strategies, and equations that would likely come up in the competition. Elijah found himself enjoying the process more than he expected. This wasn't just about proving something anymore. It was about learning, growing, and embracing his passion for math without the weight of doubt dragging him down. One day after school, as Elijah packed up his things in the classroom, Mr. Wilson approached him. Elijah straightened, unsure of what to expect. "Elijah," Mr. Wilson began, his voice careful, "I wanted to talk to you about the competition." Elijah met his teacher's gaze, staying silent. "I recommended you because I've seen the work you've been doing," Mr. Wilson continued. "You've made significant progress, and it's clear you have a real talent for this. I know things have been difficult between us, but I want you to know that I recognize your abilities." Elijah felt a strange mix of emotions: gratitude, frustration, and the lingering remnants of doubt. He appreciated the acknowledgement, but it didn't erase the months of being ignored and doubted. Still, he chose his words carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson," Elijah said. "I've worked really hard for this, and I'm glad that's being recognized now." Mr. Wilson nodded, a brief flicker of something like understanding passing over his face. "I'm looking forward to seeing how you do at the competition. Good luck, Elijah." As the teacher turned and walked away, Elijah stood there for a moment, letting the conversation sink in. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was progress. And right now, that was enough. The day of the regional math competition arrived with a sense of excitement and nervous energy. Elijah, Marcus, Sarah, and the other team members gathered outside the school, waiting for the bus that would take them to the competition venue. The air was crisp, and Elijah could feel his heart pounding with anticipation. "You ready for this, E?" Marcus asked, clapping him on the shoulder. "We've been waiting for this moment." Elijah smiled, feeling a surge of confidence. "Yeah, I'm ready." When they arrived at the competition, Elijah was struck by the sheer scale of the event. Teams from schools all across the region filled the large auditorium, the atmosphere buzzing with excitement. Elijah took a deep breath, feeling both the weight of the moment and the thrill of what lay ahead. As the competition progressed, Elijah found himself in his element. The math problems were challenging, but he tackled each one with the focus and determination he had cultivated over the past months. His team worked seamlessly together, and with every problem solved, Elijah's confidence grew. By the time the competition ended, Elijah felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. Whether they won or not, he knew he had given it his all. And when the results were announced, Elijah's team had placed second, a huge achievement given the level of competition. As they stood on the stage receiving their medals, Elijah looked out into the crowd. His mother was there, smiling proudly, and even Mr. Wilson stood at the back, watching with what looked like genuine pride in his eyes. In that moment, Elijah realized that this wasn't just about winning a competition. It was about something much bigger. It was about his journey. From being overlooked and doubted to finding his voice and standing tall in his own truth. It was about proving, not to Mr. Wilson or anyone else, but to himself, that he was more than capable. And as he stood there with his medal around his neck, Elijah knew that this was only the beginning. He had faced prejudice, doubt, and unfairness. But he had risen above it all. He had taken his place, not because someone finally gave him permission, but because he had earned it. And now, as he looked toward the future, Elijah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready. Because he had always been enough. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.